This year is the first time we haven't seen any sea ice in January. Last year we got it in December. We haven't had any big storms. Normally the community this time of the year is buried from wind drifts, from ground storms. We don't have that.
All of a sudden we understand that the future of the spit is now in question. The foundation under this spit could melt away. We could be all of a sudden finding ourselves in water.
When there's change in the Arctic, those who live here feel it most. The communities that once relied on the certainty of frozen permafrost now face instability. As this once protective barrier thaws, coastlines and riverbanks erode. Every year, homes inch closer to slipping into the ocean or river, and relocating the entire community becomes the most secure, long-term solution.
In Alaska, as well as all of the Arctic, we're warming about twice the rate of the rest of the globe. Some of the largest increases in temperature are occurring in wintertime, and that has different consequences. From a snowpack standpoint, we're seeing an earlier loss of the snowpack. That feeds into things like wildfire.
Last year, we had the second largest fire season on record as far as acreage goes. So we had about 5.12 million acres burned.
We have a warming atmosphere that's leading to things like increased wildfire activity, which then is potentially contributing to an increase in the rate of permafrost thaw, which is then fluxing more carbon into the atmosphere, more greenhouse gases, and sort of reinforcing this loop of further warming.
Research from the University of Alaska helps the Department of Natural Resources with fire management strategies. When wildfires spread, the priority is to protect life and property and to keep major highways open.
The university is an important part of getting the latest and most up-to-date information and what we might see in the future here and what we might be facing for the upcoming fire season.
The rise in wildfires affects the quality of life across the entire state. Across the entire state, our response is working to mitigate the impacts of climate change whenever possible.
No one's more concerned about our environment than we are. It's our front yard, it's our backyard, it's our side yard, it's our land.
Everything around us, we're aware of it. We grew up aware of it, being taught from our elders and grandparents and parents about everything, about the plants that grow, about the weather, about the seasons, and places where we're able to get the food that we need to survive.
It's not just about putting food on the table. It's a part of who we are.
For Arctic Alaskans, the primary concern is security of their traditional subsistence foods, continuation of their way of life.
But in the springtime when we go out with boat, because the ice is so thin out there, the bearded seals that we're after are positioning themselves when they sun on the ice, on top of the ice, in dangerous spots. So the ice is thinner and it's more dangerous for us to approach them. Because of climate change, I've had to adjust some of my hunting patterns and where I go.
The indigenous people of the Arctic are meeting this change with the same spirit that has sustained them for centuries. Through careful observation of the natural world, they recognize changes and adapt accordingly.
We would be starving if we didn't adjust like we're supposed to.
You know, in terms of adaptation, what we're talking about is how do we meet the goals that we have in terms of living a healthy, productive, sustainable life here in Alaska with these fairly drastic changes that are occurring in the environment.
When considering the future for all Alaskans, we must take into account that many communities are still challenged by insufficient infrastructure for basic sanitation, clean water supply, high energy costs, and distance to adequate health care. In a rapidly changing world, stability is needed for communities.
We're locked into a trajectory of continued warming for many decades to come. So We need to acknowledge that, and we need to try to, as best we can, understand what that future is going to look like and try to use that information to make informed decisions, whether it's business decisions or government decisions.
When monitoring climate change impacts, we must keep in mind the long-term well-being of those who call the Arctic home.
People misunderstand that we're anti-development. We're not. We're not anti-development. We just want them to develop the resources responsibly. The renewable resources can be maintained, and the natural resources can be accessed for profit, for work, for jobs, that kind of thing.
The development of Alaska's natural resources provides revenues for the benefit of all Alaskans. These revenues pay for essential services like education, public safety, roads, as well as lowering the cost of energy. In Arctic Alaska, these revenues back development of critical infrastructure and the means for increased environmental protection and climate change strategies. Focusing on sustainability, the science that informs relocation and fire management strategies is financed by responsible natural resource development.
For resource extraction, whether that's a harvest of salmon, whether that's mining for minerals, whether that's going after oil or natural gas or coal, I think that those conversations are really important for us to have as Alaskans, because in particular, if some of that, the mineral oil or coal, fossil fuel extraction may impact subsistence foods or renewable sources of economic viability and food security for the whole populations of the local area, then we really have to take that into consideration when we have the conversations around whether or not to go after certain developments.
We are people who have lived in the Arctic for hundreds and thousands of years. We may live our lives differently than our ancestors did, but we still have the same love and concern for the land itself. We still live off of the land. We still live off of the oceans, and we are considerate of anything that we do both on the land and the sea.
A uniquely Alaskan perspective, I think, would be the opinion of Alaskans that if we were to be allowed to move a project forward, whether it be community or resource development, we can do it right, and we want to do it right. No one cares more about Alaska than Alaskans do.
And I think Alaska is big enough that we can make wise decisions in regards to what areas are wise for us to develop and which areas are not wise for us to develop in order to maintain a stable economy and way of life for all Alaskans.
The state of Alaska is working with communities to respond to the impacts of climate change in multiple ways. Construction of critical infrastructure, preparation for emergency relocation and disaster response. The people of this northern land are not just survivors. They have thrived for millennia through ingenuity and adaptability. Now, due to our changing climate, the future requires more than only changing hunting patterns. It is the state of Alaska and United States' responsibility to ensure that the Arctic has the financial capacity to respond to this change. Looking ahead, we must uphold a commitment to preserving the health and well-being of land, wildlife, and people. This is the complete picture of our vital American Arctic. Alaska is a leader in renewable energy and maintains strict environmental regulations of oil and gas production, including limits on gas flaring. Climate change policy is effective when responding to localized needs for tools to adapt. The state of Alaska has been working on climate change adaptation for more than a decade. Decisions for increased investment in communities' response capacity are best when done at a local and subnational level. The state welcomes national and international partners committed to working with state agencies to reduce the impact felt by Alaskans. This includes building and maintaining public infrastructure and strengthening scientific research.